Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our talks. Next, I'd like to welcome to the stage Mr. Michael Silverstein. Thank you, sir.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for all coming out here today. And without further ado, my name, once again, is Michael Silverstein. And today I'd like to discuss with you guys my topic, which was the literature on the Eastland disaster of 1915, and the initial steps that I've done to understand this topic and write a literature review. But before going too deep into it, I'd like to talk about where I was at the beginning of the semester. If you asked me in January, Michael, what is a literature review? I don't think I'd be able to give you a very good answer. At that time, I didn't understand what the literature meant. Furthermore, I didn't understand the purpose of the review, and then what separated a good literature review from a bad one. But by actually going through the different steps, and by taking the initial steps of writing a literature review, I was able to understand that a literature review is a historiographical document. But what does this mean? Well, historiography is the study of the writings of history and the methods that historians use to analyze history. In a literature review, the author wants to share with the audience what other secondary sources have written on the subject, but then also how these different opinions differ from each other, or how they're similar. By doing this, one is explaining to the audience the actual historiography of a given topic. In my case, this was the capsizing of the SSS Eastland. So, for the rest of the talk, I'd like to explain the different steps that I took in order to eventually write a literature review, how all these different steps relate to historiography, and then also the actual personal influence they had on me. So without further ado, I'd like to start off by talking about my search for literature, then talking about my source evaluations, and then by talking about my organization of the different sources, then the next steps that I would have taken, and then finally coming to some concluding points. So, step one, search for literature. Before even starting looking for the literature, I thought it was really important to frame myself, to understand what I was looking for. I thought it was integral to keep in the back of my mind what is the literature for an event. In a lot of different cases, it depends. It will widely vary, but generally speaking, the literature for a given topic is the major sources that discuss the topic and that relate to one another. They can be books, mainly monographic sources, but they can also include things like documentaries. In my case, before going into anything, I decided to do two major things. I decided to look for a baseline of information into my subject, and then I started looking for sources and collecting different sources. When looking for a baseline, I did two major things. The first thing I did was do basic searches online about my topic, which was literature on the SSS Eastland. I found a lot of helpful things, including a historical society, which actually featured and produced one of the major sources within the literature, which was a documentary. Beyond that, I quickly moved from online into our reference section within the library. The reference section was helpful in a lot of ways, but for a baseline of information, roughly 5 of the 25 or so reference books that I looked at had information specifically on the SSS Eastland capsizing. From that, I was able to learn about all the background information I needed. But more importantly, these different reference materials also had in their reference sections links to other monographic and major sources within the literature. From that, I was able to find 3 of the 4 major monographic sources that I would use to define the literature. Some notable examples of these include the Chicago Dictionary, or a Chicago Encyclopedia, and from this I was actually able to find one of the 4 major monographic sources, which was Ashes Under Water by Michael MacArthur. Furthermore, the reference section was extremely helpful in locating subject headings, which can be used to find other literature on a given topic. By actually finding encyclopedias and dictionaries in the reference section, and then backtracking them and finding them online, I was able to locate their individual subject headings and then relate those to the SSS Eastland. From that, I found subject headings such as Steamliner disaster, Chicago disaster, and also the SS Eastland. Beyond that, moving from the reference section, I decided to look at databases and then also on our online library's resources. Using databases such as Academic Search Complete, I was able to go into the deep web and actually look for more robust and actually wider ranges of information that aren't available to the general public if they aren't using databases or academic searches. Furthermore, through the library's online resources, I was able to confirm sources, locate where they would be, and then also find further subject headings in my topic. By doing these last two steps, I was able to find additional journal articles, and then the fourth monographic source on my topic. Some troubles I ran into while doing this step, however, included trying to find as many things as possible with limited resources. This meant getting creative. For example, when I was looking for general information and reference material, I decided to look beyond just the disaster category within the library and looked at things such as the U.S. Naval Ship List. I did this because while the USS Eastland was a civilian ship, it was later repurposed into a military vessel during World War II. While a lot of things like this didn't actually give me any benefits, as they didn't have information on a USS Wilmette or the SS Eastland, what it did do was let me know what was the scope of my literature. Furthermore, moving on to step 2, which was source evaluation, I decided to do a couple of major things to understand my sources. The first thing I did was create a chronology of all the different sources so I could understand them. I'll be getting back to this in a minute. Beyond that, I decided to look at the authors and their citations. These can be helpful in numerous ways, but one of the major things it allows you to do is one can analyze the author and the information that they're looking at to understand their perspective, their profession, their background, the time they grew up in, and the specific sources they use all can play a role into how they view the historical facts. This is integral for the literature review down the line, as one needs to understand how the authors interpreted their events. For example, in my case, the one monographic source that was available to me was Ashes Underwater by Michael MacArthur. In this book, Michael MacArthur talks about how the owners of the SS Eastland, after the case, pushed the blame off of themselves, which was a major part of his book. By looking at his background and also at the sources he used, I could better understand how he came to this conclusion, as he uses numerous examples of court cases and the personal filings of those involved. Furthermore, one needs to look at the themes and major arguments within any given text and also later compare those to one another. Without this, one doesn't understand the literature to its fullest extent. Moving on, here's an example of one of the chronologies I made. In this, I only had the monographic sources available, but you can still see that all monographic sources were made within the last 25 years. This is extremely notable, as while the event has happened over 100 years ago, all major monographic sources were written within the last quarter of a century. Moving on to step 3, which is source organization, I was unfortunately not able to actually correlate and organize all my source information together, as I did not have all monographic sources available to me. What I did instead was look for how I would go about doing this. And I took inspiration from what our professor, Dr. Farrell, said in class, and then from online examples, decided the best way for me to actually analyze my sources and organize them is with Post-it note webs. By doing this, I can categorize the different information I had, and then actually move things around so I can better understand things like the different citations, arguments, perspectives of authors, and then also the timeline itself. Moving on to step 4, the next steps that I would need to take, the most important thing from this point on would be writing an actual thesis. In order to do this, I would need to look at 2 things specifically relating to my topic on the literature of the SSS Eastland disaster, which would involve looking at why all monographic major sources were written within the last 25 years, but then also looking at how the issue was both a local and national event, as most people that died in the event were Chicago natives, yet the impact it had was on a national scale. I'd like to conclude by reading you a quote from Furry and Salgoris, which we read for class, which is, "Facts do not speak for themselves, and often the known fact will bear the weight of more than one interpretation." By actually going through the different steps and writing a literature review, what you're doing is analyzing how different authors and how different historians or experts go through and actually put opinions or thoughts onto historical facts. It is our jobs as historiographers when writing a literature review to tell the audience this. Thank you for your time, and I hope you guys have a great summer.
That's fucking it.
What was that time?